March 17th, 2026, 2:47 in the morning. Somewhere along a barren stretch of asphalt, cutting through the Zagros mountain range in western Iran, a convoy of 500 fuel tanker trucks rolled slowly through the darkness. No lights, no radio chatter, just engines growling in the cold desert silence, each truck heavy with 80 tons of fuel. Military-grade diesel bound for the last functioning Iranian missile launch sites dug deep into the mountains. 40,000 tons of fuel, enough to keep Iran's remaining war machine alive for another 3 months. The convoy commander, a Revolutionary Guard logistics colonel named Farouk Shirazi, had run this same route 16 times since Operation Epic Fury began. He believed the darkness protected him. He believed the mountains protected him. He was wrong on both counts. 12,000 feet above him, invisible in the moonless sky, a pair of U.S. Air Force F-15E Strike Eagles were already painting targets. The lead weapons officer, a 29-year-old from San Antonio, Texas, stared at his targeting display. The thermal signatures were unmistakable. 500 bright white rectangles, perfect columns of heat crawling through the valley at 35 miles per hour. He pressed the transmit button and said 6 words that would seal the convoy's fate. Confirmed target, hot, 500 plus, standing by. The reply from CENTCOM was immediate. You are clear to engage. Good hunting. What happened in the next 11 minutes would be replayed on satellite footage, analyzed in Pentagon briefings, and eventually confirmed by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth as one of the single most decisive logistics strikes of the entire Iran war. Our 500 vehicles, 40,000 tons of fuel, gone. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now. We cover the biggest military events on the planet the moment they happen, and this story is one you absolutely cannot miss. This is the story of how American precision firepower, flying at 30,000 feet in the dead of night, reached down through the mountains of Iran and ripped the last lifeline from the Islamic Republic's war machine. And why? When the sun rose over those mountain roads on March 17th, the road looked like the surface of the sun. To understand why those 500 trucks mattered so much, you need to understand what Iran had already lost in the 17 days since Operation Epic Fury began on February 28, 2026. It started with assassinations and shock. On the night of February 28th, American missiles, drones, and Israeli fighter jets struck over 500 military targets across Iran simultaneously. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. The Supreme National Security Council headquarters in Tehran was reduced to rubble. 3 underground nuclear facilities, including the deep-hardened bunker at Minzadeh, were destroyed with specially designed bunker-busting munitions. In those first 48 hours alone, the United States burned through $5.6 billion in precision weapons. It was the most expensive opening salvo in modern military history, and it was only the beginning. By day 6, Iran's entire functioning air force had been destroyed. The aircraft the Shah of Iran had purchased from America in the 1970s, aging F-4 Phantoms and F-14 Tomcats that Iran had somehow kept airworthy for 5 decades, were vaporized on the ground in coordinated runway and hangar strikes. Iranian pilots who rushed to scramble found themselves flying directly into a wall of AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles. Within 72 hours of the first American strike, Iran had no functioning combat aircraft capable of reaching altitude. By day 10, Iran's navy had ceased to exist. 100 naval vessels lay at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that carries 20% of the world's oil supply, was in chaos. Iranian mine-laying vessels had scattered hundreds of maritime mines through the shipping lanes before American F/A-18 Super Hornets from the USS Gerald R. Ford and the USS Harry S. Truman obliterated every single one of the Islamic Republic's remaining surface combatants. U.S. Central Command confirmed on March 11th the destruction of 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels in a single operation. Iran's Supreme Naval Command issued their last operational order from a command bunker that was hit by a Tomahawk cruise missile 17 minutes later. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? We have viewers from over 70 countries tuning in tonight. Let us know your country in the comments below. By day 13, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stood before cameras at the Pentagon with the calm authority of a man who had just watched the most intensive air campaign since the 1991 Gulf War achieve its early objectives ahead of schedule. More than 15,000 Iranian targets had been struck. He was not boasting. He was reading from a list. Iran doesn't have a functioning air force, Hegseth said. Their entire navy is at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. Their missile force is shrinking daily. And most importantly, they don't have the ability to build more. Every company that builds every component of those missiles has been functionally defeated. But something was keeping the war going. Something the satellites were tracking with growing urgency. Something that American intelligence analysts in a secure facility at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar had spent 3 days trying to confirm and locate: fuel. Iran's military doesn't run on courage. It runs on diesel. The missile launchers scattered across the Zagros mountains, the mobile artillery units still harassing Kurdish border regions, the underground command complexes still transmitting orders. All of it required a continuous supply chain of liquid energy. And in the chaos of Operation Epic Fury, Iran's Revolutionary Guard had done something unexpected. Instead of moving fuel through the destroyed pipeline infrastructure, they had dispersed the load across hundreds of civilian tanker trucks, mixing military fuel convoys in with ordinary commercial traffic, hoping American targeting protocols would spare civilian-looking vehicles. It was a clever strategy, and for 12 days, it worked. Senior intelligence officer Captain Melissa Darrow, assigned to the 609th Air Operations Center at Al Udeid, was the analyst who broke the pattern. Working from signals intelligence intercepts, thermal satellite data, and cross-referenced commercial traffic logs, she isolated a recurring anomaly. Every 3 days, an unusually large concentration of heavy vehicles was appearing on thermal imaging along Route 73 west of Hamadan, moving south toward the Loristan province. The vehicles were cold when they departed. They were warm, very warm, when they arrived. Fuel trucks, hundreds of them. And their destinations were the dig-in Revolutionary Guard fuel depots feeding the last functioning missile sites. What Darrow had found wasn't a supply line. It was the supply line, the single logistical artery still pumping blood into Iran's broken military body. She flagged it at 9:15 p.m. on March 16th. By 11:42 p.m., the targeting package had been assembled, reviewed, approved by CENTCOM Commander General Michael Kurilla, and transmitted to the crews of 2 F-15E Strike Eagles, already airborne on patrol out of Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates. The F-15E Strike Eagle isn't a delicate machine. It weighs 36,000 pounds empty. Its 2 Pratt & Whitney F-100 turbofan engines produce 29,000 pounds of thrust each, pushing it through the sky at Mach 2.5, more than twice the speed of sound. On this mission, each aircraft carried a mixed payload of GBU-39 small-diameter bombs, AGM-65 Maverick missiles, and CBU-97 sensor-fused weapons. Cluster munitions designed specifically to find and destroy vehicles and armored equipment across wide areas. A single CBU-97 can disable 10 tanks in a single pass. Against soft-skinned fuel tankers, the effect would be something closer to annihilation. Colonel Shirazi, leading the convoy from the cab of a black Land Cruiser at the front of the column, checked his watch at 2:47 a.m. In 90 minutes, they would reach the transfer point. The fuel would be offloaded onto smaller distribution vehicles and dispersed to the final sites by dawn. He allowed himself a small measure of relief. They were almost there. He never heard the first missile. The lead F-15E rolled inverted at 12,000 feet and released 4 GBU-39s in a ripple pattern across the head of the convoy. Each bomb, no larger than a carry-on suitcase, guided itself through the darkness using GPS and inertial navigation to within 1 meter of its designated impact point. 4 trucks at the front of the column vanished in 4 simultaneous explosions that lit the valley walls orange. Before the sound of those first explosions had even reached the mountains, the second aircraft was already in its attack run, dispensing CBU-97s in a long diagonal sweep across the middle of the convoy. The sensor-fused sub-munitions descended on parachutes, scanned for heat signatures, and fired copper jets of superheated plasma downward into the tanker roofs. Trucks 87 through 214 died in a rolling cascade of secondary explosions as their fuel ignited. The chain reaction was instantaneous and total. 80-ton tanks of diesel became pressure vessels. They didn't just burn, they detonated. Colonel Shirazi's Land Cruiser was lifted off the road by the shock wave of a secondary explosion 30 meters behind him. He survived. He spent 3 hours crawling toward high ground with a broken collarbone, watching the entire mountain valley below him burn. The fire was so large it was visible from space on thermal imaging. The satellite operators at the National Reconnaissance Office in Chantilly, Virginia, logged it as a surface temperature anomaly that exceeded anything they had recorded during the campaign. 500 vehicles, 40,000 tons of fuel, an 11-minute mission. What time is it where you are right now? Tell us in the comments, because people all over the world are watching this video at this exact moment. We want to know. When CENTCOM released official footage of strikes on Iranian planes, boats, and trucks on March 12th, the international community was already beginning to grasp the scale of what America's military was doing in the skies above Iran. But the truck convoy strike of March 17th was different. It wasn't a strike on a weapons depot or a naval base. It was the surgical severance of a supply line. It was the American military doing what it does better than any force in human history, not just destroying weapons, but destroying the ability to use them. Pete Hegseth, when asked at a subsequent briefing about the strike, gave an answer that was almost academic in its precision. We're not just hitting what Iran has, we're hitting what Iran needs to keep fighting. Fuel moves missiles. No fuel, no missiles. It's not complicated. But the significance went deeper than logistics. In the weeks since Operation Epic Fury began, Iranian state television had been showing images of Revolutionary Guard commanders still in their posts, still issuing orders, still projecting the image of a regime in control. The regime's messaging to its own people was simple. We are enduring, we are resisting, we will survive. Every fuel convoy that made it through was not just military supply. It was political propaganda. It was proof that the Islamic Republic's infrastructure was still functioning under American bombardment. The destruction of 500 tankers on a mountain road in the Zagros at 3 a.m. did something American bombing of military targets could not fully accomplish. It extinguished that narrative. There were no more convoys to show. There was no more fuel reaching the launch sites. When Iranian missile crews at 3 separate hardened facilities in Loristan province attempted to conduct planned operations in the 48 hours following the convoy strike, 2 of the 3 sites were found to have insufficient fuel to power their generator systems. The launches were scrubbed. The math was already loaded in those 2 F-15Es when they rolled into their attack profiles above the mountains. 8 precision-guided bombs, 12 Maverick missiles, 4 dispersal packages, a total weapons load weighing less than 12,000 pounds, against 40,000 tons of diesel fuel and the last coherent logistics operation of a dying military. Captain Melissa Darrow, the analyst who found the pattern, received a classified commendation. Her 72-hour analysis, which identified the convoy route through a combination of satellite thermal imaging and intercepted Revolutionary Guard communications, was described in the internal CENTCOM assessment as decisive targeting work in a compressed operational timeline. She was 31 years old. She had never deployed to a combat zone. She found the convoy from a chair in a temperature-controlled intelligence facility in Qatar, using mathematics and pattern recognition and a cup of cold coffee. That's a different kind of American weapon, and it may be the most dangerous one of all. By March 14th, 2 days before the convoy strike, the United States had already conducted its most dramatic single operation of the war. In a large-scale precision bombing raid on Kargh Island, Iran's crown jewel of oil export infrastructure, the terminal through which the Islamic Republic exports nearly 90% of its oil, American aircraft struck and destroyed every military target on the island. President Trump announced it himself on Truth Social with his characteristic directness. Totally obliterated every military target in Iran's crown jewel, Kargh Island. He deliberately preserved the oil infrastructure, in Trump's words, for reasons of decency, but the military installations that protected Iran's most valuable economic asset were ash. The message was unmistakable. We can reach anything. We can destroy anything. We are choosing what to spare. Where are you watching from right now, and what do you think happens next? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This is the most watched military story on the planet this week, and we want your perspective. Iran's response to the logistical collapse was desperate and, in military terms, increasingly ineffective. Iranian proxy forces attempted harassing attacks on Gulf state ports. Iran's new supreme leadership, the identity of whom remained unclear for several days following the assassination of Khamenei, issued statements threatening to permanently close the Strait of Hormuz and target oil infrastructure across the Arabian Peninsula. But threats require the means to execute them, and the means were disappearing with every American strike. Iranian patrol boats attempting to lay mines were destroyed before they could reach the shipping lanes. Iranian drone units that attempted to strike U.S. military assets in Saudi Arabia managed a brief success on March 13th, hitting 5 U.S. Air Force KC-135 refueling aircraft on the ground at Prince Sultan Air Base. Trump was furious. The American military response within 6 hours was described by one senior Pentagon official as the most concentrated single-night bombardment of the entire campaign. The Iranians never managed a comparable strike again. The human cost on the American side was real and painful. On March 12th, a U.S. KC-135 tanker aircraft crashed in western Iraq. All 6 crew members were killed. Their names were released by the Pentagon in the early hours of March 13th. The youngest was 22 years old, from Boise, Idaho. He had deployed to the Middle East for the first time 3 weeks earlier. He had never seen combat. He died doing something as routine as aerial refueling, in an aircraft that had been flying since before he was born, in a war that had lasted less than 2 weeks. These are the costs that the thermal satellite images and the CENTCOM press releases don't show. These are the costs that matter most. By the morning of March 17th, as the fires in the Zagros mountain valley still sent columns of black smoke thousands of feet into the cold Iranian air, the mathematics of the conflict had shifted into territory from which there is no recovery. Iran had entered Operation Epic Fury as a regional military power with a functioning air force, a substantial naval presence, a vast ballistic missile arsenal, and a logistical infrastructure built across 4 decades of sanctions-era improvisation. 17 days later, the Air Force was gone. The Navy was gone. The missile production capacity was destroyed. And now, the last coherent fuel supply chain had been burned on a mountain road in the dark. The war was not over. Wars with broken countries are never simply over. But the phase in which Iran could meaningfully project military force, could threaten Gulf neighbors, could posture at the Strait of Hormuz as though it controlled the destiny of global oil. That phase ended in an 11-minute attack mission above the Zagros Mountains at 2:47 in the morning. Colonel Shirazi, when he was eventually captured by Kurdish regional forces 3 days later and transferred to U.S. military custody, was asked by the American officer processing his detention what had given away his convoy. He didn't answer immediately. He sat with the question for a long time. Then he said, "We turned on our engines, and they were already watching." That's the thing about modern American military power that Iran's strategic planners fundamentally miscalculated. It isn't just the weapons. It isn't just the F-15Es or the GBU-39s or the CBU-97 cluster munitions or the Tomahawk cruise missiles. It's the invisible infrastructure of watching. The satellites that see heat at night, the analysts who find patterns in data, the AI-assisted targeting systems that turn intelligence into strikes in less time than it takes to eat a meal. The machines are frightening. The knowledge behind them is terrifying. Iran ran its convoy in total darkness. No lights, no radio, no satellite phones, absolute communication silence, and they were destroyed anyway. Because the infrared signature of 500 diesel engines heating up cannot be hidden from orbital thermal imaging platforms. Because the pattern of departures had already been logged, analyzed, and flagged 3 days earlier by a 31-year-old analyst in Qatar with cold coffee and satellite data. The fires from the convoy were still burning when the sun came up over the Zagros. The road looked like a graveyard. 500 hulks of twisted metal stretched across 6 kilometers of mountain highway, still glowing in the early morning light. No fuel reached the launch sites. No missiles were fired. The last artery had been cut. If you've made it this far in this video, do one thing right now. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. We are covering every development in this conflict as it happens, with the depth and detail you won't find anywhere else. And drop a comment below. Do you think Iran can rebuild from this? Do you think the war ends in weeks? Or does it drag on for months? Tell us what you think. The story of the 500 trucks is not just a story about one strike mission on one night. It's the story of what happens when the world's most powerful military intelligence apparatus targets the weakest link in a breaking chain. Every component of Operation Epic Fury, the destruction of the Air Force, the sinking of the Navy, the targeting of the missile production lines, the strikes on Kargh Island, all of it was building toward the same strategic endpoint. Not the defeat of Iran's weapons, the collapse of Iran's ability to use them. A weapon without fuel is a monument. A missile without power is a statue. An army without logistics is a crowd. And in the cold dark of a mountain road in the Zagros, at 2:47 in the morning on March 17th, 2026, 2 American pilots flying a machine that cost $31 million, carrying weapons that cost less than a luxury car, destroyed the last functioning logistics operation of a military that had once threatened to reshape the Middle East. 11 minutes, 500 trucks, 40,000 tons of fuel. The fire burned for 4 days, and the sky over western Iran was very quiet after that.